Good morning once again. Let's see if I can get this. There we go. Nothing changed up there. That's good. That's one of those things you were talking about, Danny. You change a system, whatever, and it's just a little bit different on here than it was my old iPad, and so kind of scary at times. But here we are. Oh, what a beautiful day.
Amen.
Fought through 6 inches of ice, snow drifts 6 feet deep to get here this morning. Well, that weatherman couldn't have been more wrong, could he?
No.
This goes to show you who's got the control.
Who's got the control? I feel bad for those people in Lubbock and places south, but you know, in a couple days it'll all be gone.
Our grandson probably built the first snowman of his life at Texas Tech.
Yeah.
Being from the San Antonio area. He's seen a little bit of snow, but they built snowmen this big. The way he talked, the one they built was huge.
Yeah.
Don't you know those boys had a ball?
I imagine. Yeah. So there's always some positive things that come out of it.
Amen.
Yeah. Was that on, that was Saturday morning, or
Yeah.
did they get some on Friday?
I think it started Friday night.
Friday night, so
Yeah.
not enough to cancel classes on Fridays. They didn't get that, so it'll be gone in a day or so, but yeah, it was a blessing for them, the moisture, but, you know, hopefully the ice and all didn't complicate. We haven't heard anything from Kendra and the kids because we know they got some of the ice and rain and stuff ahead of the snow there in central Oklahoma. But we're glad that everybody's kind of safe here, and even though we need the moisture, we did have a pretty good outcome from it all from what they were predicting and warning. Today we're going to look at a lesson on the old law, and again it is precipitated by a question that was asked me after last week's Bible class, and it's just going to put in perspective some things on the progression, so to speak, from the patriarchal law through the Mosaic law into the Christian dispensation, so that when we talk about, say, Matthew chapter 5 verse 17, when Jesus said that he came not to abolish the old law but to fulfill it, well, just what did he mean by that? How was it fulfilled? And it helps us to understand the importance of the Old Testament. What we're going to do is look at one important part of that, and that's the sacrificial system. And by looking at that sacrificial system, I know we touched on it briefly in our Bible class way back when we were talking about the patriarchal dispensation and how that there were similarities in the patriarchal dispensation and the Mosaic dispensation. Now we're going to bring it up and develop it to the fulfillment of it in the Christian dispensation. We'll see how that all kind of worked together to produce what we now have, to give us that understanding. Now let me go back here and hit this. Oh yeah, now I know what I need to do for the next one. So, to understand the importance of the Old Testament, we need to look at this basic part of the Old Testament system, okay? The sacrificial system. But we're going to start in Genesis chapter 4, verses 3 and 4, all right? Here, Cain and Abel. We don't know how long this was after Adam and Eve were driven out of the Garden of Eden. God doesn't give us a timeline. We know that Cain and Abel are grown up, which means they could be in their teens. They could be 30 years of age, whatever. We know that Cain, shortly after this, has a wife, which means we understand from that Adam and Eve had other children. We don't know if these were the first children. These are the first men. Cain and Abel were the first men. We don't know all of that. We just know that this is what God is dealing with, or who God is dealing with in this passage. And what it says is, Moses tells us, in the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground. And Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and of their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering. Catch that, he had regard for Abel and his offering, which means he did not have regard for Cain and for Cain's offering. But was there a connection between the two? And I think if you read down through that passage, you see that there was. Because later, God tells Cain, if you'll do what's right, you will be accepted also. Very plain, very simple. So this is the first recorded actions of human beings, people offering sacrifices to God. I believe there was a sacrifice in the Garden of Eden when God made a sacrifice for Adam and Eve. Did Adam make sacrifices after that? I don't know. It's not recorded. So this is the first recorded sacrifice made by human beings. Why do you suppose people began making sacrifices? I think the answer is obvious. God commanded them. God said, make a sacrifice. You need to continue this. Sin produces death, so therefore make a sacrifice, because I didn't demand the death of Adam and Eve. I'm passing over those sins, but the sacrifice is going to be important in that process. Excuse me, why do you suppose God accepted Abel's sacrifice but did not accept Cain's sacrifice?
It was of blood.
Okay, well, that's true, but that brings us to the next point. And the Bible gives us a very good indication in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 4. By faith, Abel offered to God a more acceptable sacrifice than Cain, through which he was commended as righteous, God commending him by accepting his gifts. And through his faith, though he died, say, his brother killed him, he still speaks. Now, blood sacrifice, true. But what was the basis of it? He did it by faith. Does that mean that he just accidentally stumbled upon the right combination? No, because God had commanded sacrifice. God also instructed both Cain and Abel into what he wanted as the sacrifice, what God would accept. And it was up to both Cain and Abel to offer to God what God wanted. So this faith was Abel's practical faith. What God had told them was the faith that they needed, the instruction they needed to be accepted by God. Abel going out and doing it was practical faith. See, faith is talked about in the Bible in terms of objective faith. That's the law, or what God gives us. Subjective faith, that's whether I believe it or not, we believe it or not. But then the practical faith is when we put what God has said into action. And that's what Abel did. He put that into action. Excuse me. I'd be stepping all over those in a minute if I didn't pick them up. That's what Abel did. He put into action what God said because he believed God. Cain didn't put it into action, apparently because he didn't believe God. Now that kind of sounds like Eve in the garden, doesn't it? When she believed the devil saying, you shall not surely die. God said you will die. You shall not surely die. Well, they didn't die, but God passed over, didn't he? Through the sacrifice. You see how that kind of works out even in that next generation? So, this faith was Abel's practical faith obeying the Word of God. How do we know that? Again, Romans chapter 10, verse 17. So, then faith comes by hearing. Hearing by the Word of God. God told them. God told them what he wanted. Abel had to have heard God's commands for him to have been obedient. God didn't say, good guess, Abel. I'm so proud of you. God said, that's acceptable. You've done what I've asked you to do. Now, in the patriarchal world, sacrifice was universally prevalent, wasn't it? In the patriarchal world, what's that patriarchal world? Let's just start with, you have Cain and Abel there. Later on, you have Noah. Then you have Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. Then you have people like, before the law of Moses is given, you have Moses, before Moses gives the law of Moses. What are the children of Israel doing? They're offering sacrifices. After that, you still have people like Jethro. I wanted to say Methuselah. Melchizedek. You have a lot of Gentiles who are still offering sacrifices acceptably before God. Even to the point where you get up to the New Testament, we talked about it when we were in Bible class, Cornelius, Acts chapter 10. A man who was devout before God, who was a Gentile. He must have been offering sacrifices much like Abel had done. But he was a devout man that God accepted and wanted to come into the church. So these people say, the patriarchs, wherever they go into a different place. Think about Abraham as he went from Ur of the Chaldees down into Canaan and roamed around everywhere he went. You know what he'd do? He'd build altars. He'd build altars and he would make sacrifices and he'd leave those altars there. What was he doing? He's preaching a gospel of sacrifice. Do this for God. But these people understood it also. The heathen nations adopted the sacrificial system, but they perverted it. Much like Cain did. Cain perverted what God said. I'll do it the way I want to do it, and God will just have to accept it. Well, God didn't accept it. And that's what they did. And they perverted it in a myriad of ways, and even sacrificing their own children to their idol gods, the gods that they made up. So it was universally used. Why did they do it? Because they knew that's what God wanted. They knew God. And we'll probably look at it again, but Romans chapter 1. When they knew God, they didn't want to keep God in their mind. But they knew about sacrifice, didn't they? They knew about sacrifice and they sacrificed, but they perverted it. The sacrificial system teaches some things, but one of the most important things is the difference between clean and unclean. Now you think about that. What's the difference between a cow and a pig? To us, there's not a whole lot of difference, is there? And for us, there isn't. But God made a distinction. And God probably had some reasons for making those distinctions. But even though we can't really see a huge distinction in it, God was setting something up so he could get us or get people to understand There's a difference between what is right and wrong. There's a difference between clean and unclean. There's a difference between good and evil. A lot of the problems that we have in our culture, our society today, is that there are people calling evil good and good evil. We've blurred the distinctions. In fact, in many places, evil is called good. And if you try to do good and suggest that there is good, you're the one who's evil. So, Genesis chapter 7, verse 2, God told Noah, take with you 7 pairs of all clean animals, the male and his mate, and a pair of animals that are not clean, the male and his mate. Now, we always talk about Noah taking the animals on the ark 2 by 2, right? And they did, but it wasn't 2 of every kind. The clean animals were 14 of every kind, of all the clean animals. So God had a specific reason for demanding sacrifice to be done in a particular way, and we see that He gave regulations so that people would understand. There's a difference here. There's a difference between clean and unclean. You may not understand it. You may not even accept it. But it's God's reasoning. There's a difference between right and wrong. We may not understand it. We may not even accept it. But it's still God's way. We've got to come to the conclusion that God's judgment day, it's going to be explained to us. God is not arbitrary and capricious. God just doesn't pull things out of thin air and says, I want the tabernacle curtains to be blue because I don't like red. No, that's not what He did it. He had a reason for everything. He has a reason for everything that He does. And He has a reason for every commandment that He gives to us. We may not understand it, but we better be willing to accept it. And that's some of the things that this sacrificial system would teach us. We, at the beginning of offering sacrifices to God, have to sacrifice self. We have to sacrifice our own will. Sometimes we almost have to sacrifice our own identity to be right with God. The covenant with the children of Israel would be based on animal sacrifices. So, it was important that they pay attention to something like what was going on even in the days of Noah. Now, the patriarchal system here, you consider this as a sort of a kindergarten of religion for mankind. It prepared the Israelites for the law of Moses, did it not? Which was going to be built on the sacrificial system, which is the schoolmaster of the Christian dispensation. Again, we talked about it in Bible class this morning, Galatians 3:24. So then the law was our guardian until Christ came in order that we might be justified by faith. And again, there's that word guardian. Schoolmaster in the King James versions, okay, it's pedagogue. It's kind of like the slave who takes the child to the teacher. You can look up all the information on it. You can do a word study in there if you want to. But in order that we might be justified by faith, it was to bring us to faith, to where we would do it by faith, not as a matter of law, but yeah, there's the law, but by faith. Not only that God commanded it, but like Abel, we actually put it into practice and we want to do it because our subjective will becomes what God desires. Why didn't Christ come immediately after the sin of Adam and Eve? Very simple answer. People weren't ready, were they? They weren't ready. They weren't even ready for the sacrificial system, according to Cain, according to what happened with Cain. They weren't ready. People needed to be schooled Hey, that's a pretty good word there, isn't it? In morals, ethics, and spirituality. They weren't ready. Time would be needed to prepare men for a religion. Listen to this. This is important. Time would be needed to prepare men for a religion, men and women, for a religion that would be written in the heart. Jeremiah chapter 31 and verse 33. For a religion that would be written in the heart. That's where the gospel is written. There had to be a practical demonstration of the power of God before this law written in the heart could be revealed to people who would believe it and accept it. In other words, submit to it. Brothers and sisters, that practical demonstration was the death of Jesus Christ on the cross. If you can't look at the cross of Jesus Christ, see his death on the cross, if you can't look at the Lord's Supper and be moved by it, something wrong with your heart. Doesn't take mind. Mind is a part of it, but the heart. And that's what God was trying to get these people prepared for. This sacrifice that he was going to make of his own son for the sins of the world. People needed to understand the communication of spiritual ideas. As with the patriarchal system, people were still limited in a knowledge of religion. When Moses came and Moses gave the Ten Commandments, okay, from God, when Moses gave the law of Moses from God, did the people understand it? No. They still had to be schooled more and more. Wouldn't have done any good for Christ to die upon the cross at Sinai, would it? No more than dying in the Garden of Eden. See the process that God was working through? So here in the garden and in the patriarchal age, God was speaking to the fathers. But here with Moses, what's he doing? He's writing it down. Setting it in stone. Ten Commandments in stone. Here it is. It's right before you. A function of law was to set down or write in stone what God expected of his people. His people. Not the Gentiles. They've got some instruction. They knew. Some of them were doing it. Most of them weren't. There's no excuse for Israel not obeying the law. It was there. They have it. It was written down for all time for them. There'd be no doubt as to what constituted transgression under God's word. No doubt. Boy, they fiddled with it, didn't they? They twisted it to meet their own desires. And sometimes they just plainly ignore it. But there it was. And it was constantly a reminder that they were sinful people in need of a Savior. Just like us, right? Just like us. God had to show the weakness and futility of the way of the Gentiles. See, he chose Israel to be the keepers of the law. But he also had, that was their kind of their purpose, and they failed. Listen, they kept the law. They kept it in the box, didn't they? In the ark, the copy of the law. So yeah, we got it. We got it. But did they keep it practically? In other words, did they actually live it out? And the answer is no. You see that from the teachings of Jesus and the gospel. See? That was their purpose, though, was to keep that law and to keep it ever before them. What about the Gentiles? Was there a purpose for the Gentiles? And yes, it was. It was to show the weakness and futility of the way of the Gentiles. That shows the power of God today. for us. God had to show that weakness to show us the power of God today. Now you think of it. To do this, God let the Gentiles fail in theoretical and practical morality. How many different systems of morality do you think existed from the time of Adam and Eve being cast out of the Garden of Eden up to now? Just in the last few hundred years, you've had postmodernism come in, and to the point now where they're almost past postmodernism into something different. Then you had modernism, and you had a Renaissance, and you had I don't think we could even know how many of them worked. If any of them worked, there wouldn't have been a need for a different one, would there? Okay? So that's the point. They failed in theoretical and practical morality. Remember, the Gentiles knew God, but they refused to accept his ways, and that was Romans 1:18 through 32. Left to their own devices, people cannot produce a just and equal morality. That's what the big fight in politics today is. Why do certain people not get punished for crimes that other people who do less are getting punished for? It's not fair. But see, that's what happens when men's wills are involved in it. When you're not looking at the rule of law, you're looking at men, you're looking at people, and you're making decisions based upon the person and not the rule of law. I wonder if God kind of looks at things that way, oh no, because God is no respecter of persons. What's he a respecter of? He's a respecter of his word. My word will not return to me void. And when he judges us, he's not going to judge us on who we are, he's going to judge us on what we have actually done. So, there. The old law revealed a single standard of morality. But listen, think the Gentiles were bad? Without the law? The Jews had the law, and you know what? They failed too. They failed. Failed miserably. So, God also allowed the Gentiles to fail in theoretical and practical religion. How many different religions did they develop from the time that Adam and Eve were cast out of the Garden of Eden till now? I mean, there are new religions coming online all the time, isn't there? Yeah. This new Star Wars type